here for the doctoral dissertation defense of TC Zeng. So I need to prepare this one talk for us. So the procedure here is 45 minutes, TC will speak for, then we'll have 15 minutes of questions from the public. And we'll move into closed session in a separate room where the drill TC for several hours. That's always the last one. So take it away, TC.
Hi, everyone. My name is TC, and thank you all for showing up. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you what I've been working on over the course of my PhD today. We're going to start from an unusual place, but stay with me, okay? So at the beginning of my PhD, I read the work of literary scholar Eric Auerbach, who basically founded the field of literature. He showed that writers across Western history have been influenced by two great traditions in terms of how they represent reality in their work. Inspired by him, I'm going to present two cultural artifacts from these same two traditions that embody distinct intuitions about what kind of a thing intelligence might be. The first is a statue of Athena, goddess of wisdom among the Greeks. Here's a couple of interesting things about her. First, she was not born of a pregnant woman or even a pregnant goddess, but from the headache of a man. Zeus was her father. After several days pounding migraine, she sprang fully formed into existence out of her dad's forehead. Not only was she already born an adult, she was born already clad in armor, ready for battle. What does this tell us? That to the Greeks, intellect or wisdom, if personified, would be a being with no childhood, no development, no history, no body, and little to do with any kind of physical development. The second artifact, cultural artifact, is a piece of writing that comes from the wisdom literature of the Middle East, from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levant. One specific strand of this literature would go on to have an incredible impact on Western thought. I am talking, of course, about Jewish wisdom literature from the Old Testament. In this piece of writing, intellect is again personified as a woman, but that's where the similarity ends. In this context, she doesn't show herself in acts of willful youth or glamorous heroes. Instead, she speaks in the voice of a parent to a child. Here, being smart is not a state, but a process and an action. Get wisdom, a process that is marked by learning. And here, the parent is qualified to speak about what it means to be smart, not because they've been blessed by the gods, but because the parent was once like their child, also having to learn, develop, and mature. In other words, the capacity for skilled action is rooted not in thought, but in experience, and such experience can be shared. So why did I talk about this? The thing is, if you have an excessively Greek intuition about what it means to be smart, that can make it difficult to see how human intelligence could have evolved. Alfred Russel Wallace famously thought that human intelligence could not be explained by natural selection. And Noam Chomsky, who believed that language basically is thought, proposed that human language and thus human intelligence emerged from a macro mutation, possibly in a single individual, which is a very weird evolutionary scenario. In the same vein, Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," and his words have been taken by many to emphasize the autonomy and power of the isolated human mind. But we are evolutionary biologists. We understand that minds don't just sit there and think, they have a purpose, which is to learn. And this learning always has to do with a specific context. So for us, it's more like, I learn, therefore I am. That's my proposal. And this suggests that to understand the evolution of human intelligence, we should perhaps look at how human learning environments are different from those in the rest of the biological world. And that brings me to the core idea of my dissertation. Informational niche construction. Basically, across human evolutionary history, culture has systematically changed the kinds of information available to inform action and the kinds of problems that we have to solve. This alters the computations that our minds tend to perform and may account for why we are so cognitively peculiar. I will present my work in 4 chapters. In the first chapter, I focus on the fact that humans depend on learning from others. I show that the mere presence of other skilled individuals changes the learning environment in ways that promote the evolution of a specific kind of intelligence that many see as distinctively human. The next chapter focuses on how culture can change the way that information is communicated between people or how it flows across populations. This changes how our information is sampled, explaining why some cultures produce analytic thinkers while others produce holistic ones. This is a major dimension of cross-cultural variation in cognitive style. The next chapter extends this ecological logic to the physical world of tools and buildings and the social world of norms and institutions. In short, the problems that we solve on a daily basis have been pervasively simplified due to the proliferation of standardized cultural products in both the physical and the social worlds. And in the final paper, I document one episode where a suite of standardized cultural products emerged suddenly and explosively across a large area of Northern Eurasia in the ancient past. So now let's move on to the first chapter on how social learning led to the evolution of human-like intelligence. First, intelligence is a fuzzy idea. What even are we talking about here? For this paper, I focus on one characteristic of the human mind that has attracted a lot of attention from scientists across many fields. This characteristic is that we can adapt flexibly and quickly to contingent situation-specific details in pursuit of our goals. We see this definition embedded in a statement put out by a group of 52 psychologists in 1994. The statement goes, intelligence is a very general mental capacity that involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. We can see that in those last two clauses, there is again this emphasis on quick responding to whatever arises in our experience. The interesting thing is that current theories in computational cognitive science, developmental psychology, and machine learning trace all these other mental capacities as deriving from the last two that I've just mentioned. And we shall see why as we go along. Because of this shared theoretical approach, I will be calling these the cognitive sciences from now on. So what are the options other than learning quickly from experience? They are not learning from experience, so fixed behaviors or routines, and learning slowly from experience, so seeing similar situations over and over again before you learn what to do. To see why learning quickly from experience is so important, we have to go back to the cognitive revolution in psychology back in the 60s. Back then, B.F. Skinner and his behaviorist school believed that all learning in humans and animals was because of reinforcement, that we learn all our adaptive behaviors purely from associating our actions with painful and pleasurable outcomes. Skinner even believed that people could learn language from reinforcement alone. But then Chomsky appeared, or reappeared in this presentation. He pointed out that humans can produce billions of sentences, many of which we've never spoken before in our entire life. And we can't have learned how to speak English by being rewarded for producing every possible sentence of the English language when we were children. Chomsky instead proposed that we use a small set of representations, in other words, a model of the grammar of English. This model helps us to learn from a small corpus of sentences how to construct or understand the rest of the sentences of the English language. Chomsky, Tolman was working on mouse navigation. If you replace one maze with another, mice were still able to figure out the new route to their feeding spot very efficiently. They did not respond to a new maze by exploring aimlessly and did not need to be rewarded or punished into figuring out the new route. This meant that they must use the information that they learned from previous navigation episodes in, again, an abstract representation, here a mental map, to navigate correctly. These scientists spearheaded the cognitive revolution by showing that pure reinforcement cannot account for all learning. They introduced three foundational concepts to the cognitive sciences, which have remained core to this day. They are inference, cognitive structure, and generalization. Cognitive structures are mental models that give the mind the capacity to transfer information from a small set of experiences to apply to a broader range of new problems. In other words, they enable generalization. Without cognitive structures, every situation has to be learned about independently in an inefficient way. And inference is the mental capacity to figure out what the right model is given your observations. Of course, fast, flexible, and structured learning is not the only route to adaptive behavior. Fixed responses can also be adaptive if they've been shaped by natural selection, by evolution. And if you have neither the instincts nor the cognitive structure, you can always fall back on learning slowly from experience by training like memorization like process. In other words, things that resemble raw associational learning. So generally, there is a three-way distinction between cognitive strategies, which we shall see again and again throughout this talk. So what are these mental models that help in learning quickly from experience? The cognitive sciences have shown that broadly they fall in two groups. The first are concepts, categories, and theories. These structures tell the organism what things are similar to what other things, so that you can generalize between them by treating these objects in the same way. Models of grammar are an example of this. These models help a mind to learn more and more quickly as it gains an expanding stock of abstractions useful for generalizing about previously encountered objects that then tell you about the properties of a new object. The second are world models, which, given any situation, help the organism predict what's going to happen next or predict the outcomes of their own actions. If an animal has a world model and knows what to do or expect in some set of situations, it can generalize this knowledge to other situations. Cognitive maps are one such example. World models help an organism to plan ahead, plan prospectively, and so minimize the quantity of learning it has to do even in new situations. Without world models, an organism can still act in new situations, but it would be guided only by reinforcement history. In other words, it has to unlearn and relearn habits that prove useful in the new situation in a slow, inefficient process. So we've seen that cognitive structures are essential to learning quickly because they enable inferential processes that produce generalizable models from learning over multiple episodes in a lifetime. In contrast, minds that rely on instinct can also behave adaptively, but this comes from natural selection. And last of all, if you lack cognitive structure, you can also learn adaptive behaviors over a range of situations, but in a data-heavy process. Okay. So my goal in the first chapter was to see if the existence of social learning promotes the evolution of this structured strategy over the other two. I set up a simple evolutionary model and simulate minds that implement these three strategies competing against each other. I then throw in social learning to see how that changes things. I explore a 6-dimensional parameter space. For each combination of parameters, I throw in the three strategies and see how they fare. Now I can show you 6-dimensional results, so I'll be showing you a 2D slice of the results that are more representative. So this is how each strategy performs under individual learning, no social learning yet. In this region of the parameter space, you have the fixed behavior agent evolving. In that region, you have the unstructured learner evolving. In this region, you have the structured learner evolving. Now let's throw in social learning and see what happens. Boom. So structured learners now evolve in a larger area of the parameter space. So why does this happen? Notice that the first thing that has taken place is that the structured learner and the unstructured learner, both of them have expanded at the expense of the instinctual fixed agent. The reason for this is that social information benefits both the structured and the unstructured learner, but it does not benefit the instinctual agent because the instinctual agent doesn't learn, right? So it cannot make use of the social information. The next thing to notice is that the structured learner has expanded at the expense of the unstructured learner. And this happens because when the unstructured learner receives social information, it treats that information as relevant to only one situation, namely the situation that it saw its teacher perform the action in. It does not generalize from this information, but the structured learner generalizes from this social information. It uses information about how to act in one situation to inform how it should act in a range of other situations. The structured learner, in other words, is better able to extract information from social learning. The general intuition for why social learning promotes the evolution of structured cognition is that social learning floods the environment with cheap generalization problems. All organisms have to generalize to some extent because in learning, especially in individual learning, you have to generalize from previously collective experiences to future problems. And this previous experiences may have been collected in a relatively expensive learning process. But when other skilled individuals are present, you have a cheap source of information to exploit so long as you can generalize correctly. So social learning increases the payoff to minds that generalize. Why is this interesting? Human beings are massive outliers in how much of our adaptive behaviors are socially learned by cumulative culture. What the model in the first chapter shows is that intense demand for social learning can drive the evolution of a specifically human type of intelligence that uses abstract models to generalize about the world. So culture may explain how our minds evolved to learn abstract generalizable theories of our environments. However, these models only work if the world actually has statistical structure that can be captured in these models. Now, presumably the world is mechanistic, So you can build models that can predict arbitrarily complex phenomena. But just because the world can be modeled in principle does not mean that it can be modeled in practice. For example, it would be amazing if an organism were able to predict the weather several days out, predict natural disasters, predict climate change. It will be amazing if they could predict how their pathogens, their predators, or their prey will evolve several generations out. But the problem with this is you'll have to blanket, the environment with sensors, and you have to simulate, the information that you collect with such high fidelity that is computationally infeasible. In fact, if you could simulate these phenomena and you can manipulate your children's development so that they are born adapted, you've basically circumvented natural selection, right? There's no need for natural selection to happen anymore. What actually happens is that organisms don't predict these phenomena, but evolve in response to them due to natural selection. So like in the rest of biology, behavioral fit to the environment arises from both adaptation over many generations, i.e. evolution, and adaptation in one generation, i.e. learning. And it is adaptation over many generations that creates an evolved body with an evolved mind that then enables adaptation over one generation. This means that human intelligence has not made us logically omniscient in a way that allows us to escape our niche. We are just bound within a very peculiar informational niche. However, just because we are niche bound doesn't mean we can't wrestle with our niche. We can negotiate with our niche through niche construction processes. The question for us then is that, there's many animals that actually construct niches. They make persistent changes to the environment that then change the selective pressures for the next generation. The question for us is, has human culture created more simple statistical structures in our environment that then shape our cognitive development and our cognitive evolution? If it has, then there is another route by which natural selection can affect adaptation in one generation. Cultural adaptation over many generations can create culturally constructed informational environments that also shape how we learn. This brings us to the next two chapters. In the second chapter, we focus on how culture changes how information is sampled, which explains the evolution of analytic and holistic thought, a major distinction that cultural psychologists make in how people from different cultures think. So what is analytic and holistic thought? The psychologist Nisbet describes it in the following way. Analytic thought rests on the assumption that the behavior of objects can be understood in terms of straightforward rules. Analytic thinkers have a strong interest in categorization, which helps them to know what rules to apply. Formal logic plays a role in problem solving. Holistic thinkers attend to objects in their broad context. The world seems more complex. Understanding events always requires consideration of a host of factors that operate in no simple deterministic way. Formal logic plays little role in problem solving. The person who is too concerned with logic may be considered immature. Okay, so this passage contrasted Westerners and East Asians, but really psychologists have found everyone else except for weird populations are holistic to some extent. Weird refers to Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, the acronym coined by my PI. So, and weird populations are psychologically distinctive in many ways. For example, they're extremely individualistic. All other populations from Latin America, Africa, the rest of Asia, the Middle East prove to be more holistic than weird populations. And that's at the level of nation states. Even among small-scale societies, psychologists have found that horticulturalists and farmers are more holistic in thinking, and foragers and pastoralists are more analytic in thinking. Now we're going to go through some of the experiments that show these differences between analytic and holistic thinkers. The first difference is that holistic thinkers prefer more complex theories, and you can see this in both concepts and classification, as well as in causal judgments. For example, in an experiment, some participants were told a story where a grad student killed their professor. Actual thing. Yeah. They then saw a list of facts. And analytic thinkers tended to believe that only a few of the facts were causally relevant to what happened, but holistic thinkers tended to believe that many of them were causally relevant. When asked to classify an object into one of two groups, analytic thinkers tended to classify the object into a group according to a fixed rule over one feature, here the requirement to have a straight stem instead of a curved stem. But holistic thinkers tended to group the object according to overall similarity along all of the featural dimensions. The next difference is that holistic thinkers tend to think that when learning about a situation, the surrounding context is very important, but analytic thinkers less so. So holistic thinkers Holistic thinkers tend to remember objects within their context and pay more attention to the surrounding context than analytic thinkers do. In one experiment, participants were shown some pictures of fish, and then after a while, they were shown the same fish, but in unchanged backgrounds. They were then quizzed to see if they've seen the fish before. The change in background affected the recall of holistic thinkers more than it did for analytic thinkers. Holistic thinkers notice changes to the backgrounds of images more easily than thinkers do. And if you have to match two line segments based on their absolute length, analytic thinkers do better. But if you have to match two line segments based on relative length relative to the background, holistic thinkers perform better. If you ask an analytic thinker why a grad student killed their professor, they are more likely to give explanations like, oh, he just has a murderous personality. But the holistic thinkers will also refer to contextual factors as well. For example, that the grad student was having a bad day or was improperly raised because they had maybe a bad family or something like that. Okay, so the next major difference is that holistic thinkers are better at detecting statistical correlations in the environment and tend to prioritize trained experiences over abstract theories and rules in judgment and decision-making. They are less bothered by logical contradiction and are more prone to hindsight bias. What that means is that after they see something surprising that contradicts their expectations, they're more likely to say, actually, it still fits with my theory. I expected that all along. But analytic thinkers tend to prioritize abstract rule following in decision-making and respond more strongly to contradictions. And last of all, holistic thinkers tend to learn better from observation, but analytic thinkers tend to learn better from actively intervening in whatever they're learning about. Now, the question is, why do these cultural differences exist? This is an especially pressing question because the cognitive models that we saw previously for how people derive explanations or theories from data rely on universal principles of statistical inference and computational optimality. So why should people from different cultures reach different conclusions or behave differently after seeing the same data? We provide an informational ecological account for this phenomenon. Culture can change the way that information about the world is sampled. People in different cultural groups then adapt to different sampling regimes in ways that alter how they make inferences from data. Specifically, differences in sampling change how strongly we prefer simple explanations for what we see. In other words, how strongly we apply Occam's razor. We're going to go through this step by step, so stay with me. The first thing to note is that Occam's razor emerges naturally in Bayesian inference, and people prefer simpler explanations over complex ones when both explain the data. The reason is that simple explanations are consistent with few outcomes. They are small theories, but complicated explanations with many variables are compatible with many outcomes. They are large, so they require a suspicious coincidence to explain just what you saw. For example, to explain who moved my cheese, the explanation David did it is intuitively more preferable to David moved it, then Peter moved it again, and then Julia moved it. The small, simple model may be compatible with only what you saw, but the more complicated model involving many people could have produced many other outcomes also. So any outcome is less likely to be produced by the complicated model than by the simple one. However, this strongly depends on how your data were sampled. If your data were not directly generated by the system you're learning about, but was produced by some other sampling frame, then there's no reason to prefer simple models anymore. To see this, look at the following task. Here, participants have to guess the length of an interval along the number line based on samples that were drawn from within that interval. As you see more and more numbers that are concentrated in a small area, your preference for a smaller interval gets stronger and stronger because the large hypothesis for the length of the number line, the number interval, could have produced any other distribution, right? But the smaller hypothesis can explain only what you saw. But what happens if you suspect that there's a filter that is filtering your observations? Then the concentration of data points doesn't reflect the size of the interval, but reflects the filter, right? So as you see more and more concentrated data points, there's no reason to prefer the smaller models. Another example, maybe numbers are not drawn from the interval itself, but are suggested at random. And then a teacher labels these numbers as falling inside or outside the interval. In that case, it's possible that the concentration that you saw is just because of the random, suggestion process, right? It doesn't reflect the size of the interval again. So once again, concentrated data doesn't cause you to prefer smaller hypotheses. So what this means is that when you have strong sampling, you are sampling data directly from the hypothesis. you should show strong proximity preferences. You prefer simpler explanations. The simplest explanation is best. But when you have weak sampling, you don't have this preference, right? Because there might be data that is filtered out that you haven't seen yet. So, our account proposes that holistic thinkers tend to live in more weakly sampled environments where information tends to be more filtered, and observations are more incidentally accumulated, which gives rise to weak proximity preferences, while analytic thinkers live in more strongly sampled environments because their observations tend to be more complete, more systematically gathered, which gives rise to strong proximity preferences. Can this explain the differences between analytic and holistic thinkers? Yes, it can. So I implemented strong versus weak proximity preferences in a computational model of cognition, here classification, and I show that this can reproduce the differences in analytic and holistic thinkers in terms of classification behavior. And I show that different proximity preferences can also explain why analytic thinkers tend to concentrate their belief in simpler models that involve only the people or the objects directly involved in an outcome, but holistic thinkers tend to assign more credence broadly to more complex models that involve background factors. I also show that strong proximity preferences mean that analytic thinkers, after they see something surprising, tend to have a large swings in belief distribution from one simple model to another. But holistic thinkers, because they tend to have more complex model mixtures of more complex models, show smaller patterns of updating. And this could explain why there's less sensitivity to contradiction, there's more hindsight bias, less surprise. Likewise, because holistic thinkers tend to have complex model mixtures, the abstract components of a single model, like objects, features, and so on and so forth, become less important for holistic thinkers than analytic thinkers. Complex model mixtures also call for a broader distribution of attention to background factors that analytic thinkers would count as causally irrelevant. However, why would people in different cultures see differently sampled observations? In the next section, we're going to go through some of the features of a cultural environment that can change how people come by their observations that they use to make sense of the world. The first factor is relational and geographic mobility. In some societies, people can go wherever they want and speak to whomever they wish. But in some other societies, people are more restricted in where they can go and which people they can talk to. For example, weird societies frequently have high rates of relational and geographic mobility, but many societies that are not weird, developing countries, have high levels of social and residential segregation by caste, ethnicity, gender, or kinship group. And in many non-weird societies, there tends to be lower interpersonal trust among strangers, so people will tend to stick with others who they know or those they grew up with. Among hunter-gatherers and pastoralists, social networks are looser and more fluid, and people have more freedom of movement. But in horticultural and agricultural societies, people are often bound into tighter social networks that are also tied to specific geographic localities. These differences in mobility patterns can limit the range of contexts that you can explore in both the physical and social senses of the word, and change the sampling processes that assemble the sets of observations you use to make sense of the world. The second factor that can affect sampling strength is how skills tend to be taught in your society. Apprenticeship learning tends to prevail in many traditional societies. In such conditions, you, the apprentice, take part in an already established production process. So you contribute to household needs while you're still learning. Your teacher teaches you by in-context demonstrations so that what you see is shaped by the local context, which are local production needs. But in some other societies, people learn in a specialized pedagogical environment that is separated from productive activities, i.e. classrooms or dedicated courses. In such conditions, students learn via verbal instruction from a specialized class of knowledge workers, i.e. teachers, who are free to systematically collect knowledge that they then formalize into generalizable principles. They then transmit these abstract theories to prepare their students for the widest range of possible futures. Differences in how skills are transmitted also affect how much learners can depend on passive observation versus active interventions. Under apprenticeship learning, because learners are contributing to household needs as they learn, they are often more closely monitored by adults. There is less scope for self-directed exploration. There is usually little question asking, and when parents interact with their children, it is often to prevent mistakes in production. But in societies that are wealthy enough to design specialized pedagogical environments, such as playrooms, labs, classrooms, or specialized course venues, learners are freer to engage in self-directed exploration and are freer to ask their teacher questions about the distant and the hypothetical. The next set of cultural differences have to do with communication styles. In many cultures, you are supposed to learn appropriate social behaviors by engaging in a kind of apprenticeship learning, by observing other people's social behavior in context. One thing you're not supposed to do is to ask directly what the other person wants or ask for explicit instruction on what you're supposed to do. These societies have what has been called high context communication. In contrast, in the modern West, there is ever more of an expectation that we should explicitly communicate our needs. And in many environments, for example, workplace environments, social norms are supposed to be explicitly stated instead of remaining unspoken so that everyone can engage on a level playing field. In other words, there is more of a demand that people should be taught a generalizable theory for social interaction. These societies engage in what has been called low context communication. So we see that differences in how skills are transmitted shade gradually over into differences in communication styles in general. For the last factor, recall that some societies have a class of knowledge worker known as teachers who gather observations systematically so that students can have maximally generalizable knowledge. In fact, there are many other classes of knowledge worker that play a similar role in society, such as journalists, historians, scientists, or members of professional organizations like engineers or physicians. These knowledge workers are expected to gather and share information systematically, and they create this sense of a public record that provides a consensus understanding for the social and physical worlds. However, in many other societies, such knowledge worker classes are less powerful or less autonomous in their activities, or even completely absent. In these societies, information will still spread, but less systematically in a more incidental way, in the form of accounts that percolate slowly among networks of friends or stories shared around a fireplace or behind closed doors. In these societies, the boundary between anecdote and data is less clear, and you cannot infer from your observations in the same way. In conclusion, culture can shape the way information is sampled. This induces psychological adaptations that can alter the way people make inferences that in turn produce holistic and analytic thought. So we see that culture can have this effect. However, what happens if culture changes the underlying systems themselves by making them easier to learn about? This is the topic of our next chapter, from richer to leaner cultures and minds, depth of standardization in cultural evolution, together with Ivan. To see how culturally constructed artifacts in the social and physical realms can change how we should solve everyday problems, we shall go through a bunch of examples. In each one of these examples, I want you to notice how tools make the problem easier to solve by the application of some kind of abstract generalizable template. For example, compare building a wall out of raw unfinished stone that you carve so that all the blocks fit together, which is the case in Andean stonework. Here you see from Inca structures in Peru, versus the kind of problem you're solving when building a wall out of bricks. Compare whittling and carving a bed out of raw wood versus assembling a bed that you got from IKEA. Compare engaging in a series of complicated gift to maximize a basket of goods, reputation, and so on, as well as material goods such as pigs and yams, versus Bitcoin trading. Or compare trying to get your means of transport, your herd of camels, by a delicate negotiation process with your extended male relatives versus getting a vehicle by going to the DMV and signing a form. So in all of these examples, something has clearly changed in terms of the cognition involved. Specifically, the more effectively structured activities seem easier to deal with by using some kind of abstract generalizable model that ignores many context-specific details. This is caused by the presence of new physical artifacts, such as bricks or plywood blocks, and also new social artifacts, such as impersonal norms, interchangeable social roles, bureaucracy, or money. To see in greater detail how this works, we're going to see some more basic examples. Compare the skills you have to deploy when carrying a bunch of apples with your bare hands versus carrying them in a basket, or catching butterflies with your bare hands versus catching them in a net, or catching a mouse with your bare hands, which is something people can do, versus catching them with a trap, okay? In all of these cases, when you're trying to perform the skill without the tool, the system that you're dealing with is very, very sensitive right? It's very sensitive to initial conditions. The cultural artifacts counter this by drawing many initial states into a limited set of final outcomes. Tools for doing this in the physical realm include nets and traps, and tools for doing this in the social realm include management hierarchies that involve task delegation. Secondly, without the tool, the system you're often quite open. It can be perturbed by many details of the surrounding environment in a very unpredictable way. In other words, everything is related to everything. So in each new environment, you need to control for the effects of that specific environment. The cultural artifacts counter this by isolating the system from its context so that the system functions in the same way even across changing environments. Physical examples of this include baskets or houses, and examples include cultural constructions such as impersonal norms or standard operating procedures. The overall effect of this is that cultural artifacts can induce statistical regularities in both social and physical environments so that we can make sense of them using abstract generalizable models. In other words, cultural artifacts cause our environments to become increasingly standardized. Each layer of standardized outcomes can in turn promote the emergence of yet more standardization at a higher level. So standardization can build on top of itself. For example, at left, we see how Himba women construct houses by hand with no standardized components and with no management hierarchies, no interchangeable roles. At right, we see in a cathedral something that is much larger in scale. The reason why an architect can plan a massive structure like a cathedral is that he or she can make recourse to abstractions like walls, joints, pillars, capitals, and so on and so forth. And they can do this because lower levels of the organizational hierarchy, such as bricklayers and carpenters, can, in combination with their tools, solve the local problems that threaten to disrupt locally standardized outcomes. The same thing happens in the social world. Cultural artifacts here help social exchanges to unfold in a standardized way, which can catalyze the emergence of social systems at larger scales. For example, economic exchanges in small-scale societies are deeply enmeshed in local, specific relationship histories. But at a supermarket counter, the transactions do not depend on the relationship history between you and the cashier. Similarly, in bureaucratic professional workplace environments, we are expected to behave in a way that conforms to organizational roles. A strict wall separates our behavior in the workplace from our personal lives. Such norms explain why McDonald's franchises, for example, operate in the same way everywhere else in the world. And it's part of the reason why the McDonald's CEO has such great control over their organization. So cultural artifacts in the social realm help organizations scale up, and standardization in general helps in the control of events at larger and larger scales or to greater and greater levels of precision. Thus, the third chapter shows that how cultural artifacts change the cognitive properties of our environment by increasing standardization. This increasing standardization of artifacts has been happening for a long time. Evidence for this stretches as far back as Homo erectus. But one thing that our examples show is that it is an ongoing process in cultural evolution that continues today, which may have consequences for cognitive development. We cover this extensively in our paper, but do not have enough time to go into this in our presentation. The last chapter I will include is an ancient DNA paper, which is overall less related to the project of the dissertation, but one aspect is related to it, namely the rapid emergence of a suite of standardized cultural artifacts around 4,000 years ago. At this time, what archaeologists have called the Sema tribunal phenomenon took place, when a standardized suite of bronze artifacts spread in an explosive way across a huge swathe of Northern Eurasia within the span of approximately a century or so. These artifacts have an incredibly... Here you can see some of these artifacts, most of which are weapons, and all of which you can see are very finely made. These artifacts are incredibly homogeneous. They have a standardized form wherever they are found, from the Baikal to the Baltic Sea. The vast majority of these artifacts are single finds found in burial sites across different archaeological cultures that span the length of Northern Eurasia. But large numbers of these artifacts are also recovered from these necropolises, which you can see in these diamonds. So necropolises are sites that contain only burials and no signs of settlement. So they are like ritual sites. So this distribution of these bronze artifacts is very mysterious, and a lot of archaeologists have there's been a lot of controversy about how to explain something like this. We sequenced 16 samples from these necropolises and analyzed them using 3 analytic pipelines. The headline finding from all three methods is that same tribunal genomes are incredibly diverse. And the really crazy thing about this is that almost every single genetic component that you see represented in the same tribunal sites come from hunter-gatherer populations, so forager populations, except for this genetic component and this, to some extent, this genetic component. Every other genetic component comes from a foraging population. And so these are metallurgical foragers, which is very, very interesting. And in fact, the best archaeological evidence shows that most of these weapons were actually cast by foragers from this population, though there's some evidence from other places as well. And the question is, how did they all converge on this? How did they all converge in the center of Eurasia, right? So archaeologically, there's some evidence that they skied, possibly on horse-drawn skis. Okay, so and so in my previous chapter, in the actual paper itself, we discussed what are the conditions under which standardized cultural artifacts or standardized sort of social organizations, rituals, and so on and so forth tend to arise. One of our conclusions is that intense interaction between extremely heterogeneous populations is likely to select for patterns of social exchange that unfold in the same way regardless of cultural context. The classic example for this is money, but something like this, something similar to this, might be happening here as well. So to conclude, we can see that human learning environments have been massively modified by culture in such a way as to affect our cognitive developments. In fact, this has happened so much so that we can be said to live in informational colonies that change the landscape of problems faced by our developing brains. In this sense, it is culture that has driven us into the cognitive niche. And in line with such a view, our intuitions about intelligence will perhaps be more scientifically useful, at least for us biologists and anthropologists, if they were not grounded in a Platonic view of what intelligence is as this otherworldly thing, but grounded in theories of practical reason at the individual or collective level. Thank you. Question. Questions then?
Yeah, so now we'll move into the public phase. We have 17 minutes.
Okay.
So can you field your own questions?
Yeah.
All right, so go ahead and ask away.
Yeah.
It's possible that through like continuous standardization, we'll ever get to like a point where the world is so standardized that you simply don't need to learn anymore, and you can like there might be some sort of switch to like actually, because our culture becomes so complex, especially like really just like AI is running the show almost, that like basically the pressures are sort of changed because the world is so standardized that learning is no longer necessary and switch to some sort of other system.
Yeah, so me and Ivan have talked extensively about this. And basically what is happening is all the skills that you can learn in the world are steadily being substituted by things that look like button pressing, basically. So like all the adjustment to local details is handled by whatever machine or tool that you deploy when you press the button, and you don't have to do any of the adjustment. So there is this sense in which, yes, it is possible that something like that has been happening. And we have talked about this. There's some evidence for this also. They're using smartphones more and more to the extent that they cannot use PCs anymore. So a richer tool like Word, for example, they find it very difficult to do this. So something like this can definitely happen. Yeah. And it's also a question that people working in AI have been asking, right? One of the questions that they've been asking is does our use of AI substitute for the more sort of lower level problem solving, or does it sort of replace the more abstract problem solving? People have been asking questions like that.
Yeah, I have two questions, but I'll ask them one at a time. The first is on your first paper. So it sounds like an essential feature of the trade-off between structured and unstructured learning is that you assume generalization in structured learning, but not in unstructured learning.
Yes.
And I was just, can you motivate why? I think of canonical or sort of model of human unstructured learning being deep RL, but you have this whole deep convolutional neural network. Its entire job is to do generalization. It's just generalizing on more surface level statistical features rather than a causal model or something more discrete. why assume no generalization?
So right now I've set up the three strategies to be ideal and completely distinct from each other. But in reality, there's this continuum between them, right? And to go into sort of like how the continuum works, we have to start talking more detail about, what are the goal states, like do the abstract goal states, are they born already? Like, and after that you have to fill in what you have to do with learning, or do you have no goal states at all, and so on and so forth. And there's also in the world of concepts and classification, there's also this phenomenon where we might be born with an expectation at a more abstract level that biological types are represented in trees, but the specific details of what the contents of those trees are actually filled in by learning. So the generalization and non-generalization, these two strategies, they interdigitate in a very, very complex way. And I go and talk about this in more detail in the paper. But for the model, I just split the three into this extremely distinct and idealized forms of learning behavior, and I just let them compete with each other.
Great, yeah, thanks. The second question regards your second paper and your use of weak versus strong sampling.
Yeah.
And so I want to get your thoughts on which of these possibilities better fits the data that we have on differences between holistic and analytic thinkers. Yeah. So one of the earliest empirical results on weak and strong sampling, I think it was Fei Zhu, showed that very young infants, maybe in the second year of life, can draw different inferences based on evidence about whether the sampling procedure was strong or weak. Yes. And then one might think that even if there are differences in our ecology or social ecology between small scale and large scale societies, from a very young age, we would be sensitive to whether the sampling regimes are strong or weak. So that when an experimenter arrives and says, I have a task, let's see how you generalize in this task, they're actually going to treat the task identically because it's going to be evident to them whether this particular task is a strong or weak sampling regime. I understand. One possibility is that the tasks themselves are ambiguous with respect to the sampling regime. So they're just bringing background knowledge about the overall prevalence of strong or weak regimes within their local ecology. Yes. And that's what's making the difference. Yes. The other is that you're asserting something a little bit stronger yourself, which is, no, even given strong evidence that it's a strong regime or a weak regime, nevertheless, they're overriding that because of their lengthy experience with one or the other type in their own ecology. Which of those do you think is going on? Okay, so let me just be clear. So the first one is you have a consistent assumption about strong or weak sampling. Sorry, the first one is you actually update your idea about whether or not data has been gathered in strong or weak sampling to every single situation. Well, the first is when the experimenter arrives, the experimenter is being unclear about sampling. Yes. And so people are falling back on their priors given other tasks they've encountered in their ordinary lives. Yes. The second is a much stronger hypothesis, which says the experimenter was being perfectly clear about whether this was a strong or weak regime. Fei Zhu's showing that a young baby is going to be responsive to that. But maybe after a lifetime of experience, mostly in the strong regime or mostly in the weak regime, even when given unambiguous evidence, you're just bound and determined to view it through one or the other of those lenses. Yeah, I understand. I think that these two are almost a little bit mixed because in some sense, the model that the experimenter is trying to communicate, the data that went into that model, it could be strong or weak samples, either way. So this kind of strong and weak sampling thing, it applies at the population level. And so I guess that is one way of looking at this. The other aspect is, people talk about the importance of pragmatics. And I get that pragmatics are really important here. People might walk into experiments with different expectations about what the experimenter is trying to do. And I think actually to some extent, this is shaped by some of the stuff that we were talking about, some of the cultural differences that we were talking about as well. So I think it is true that what you're raising, which is incredibly clearly stated. I should write about how exactly all these things mix together and like all these different cultural effects that I mentioned, like how do they match onto what you're saying? And I think that would be really good to actually add to the paper. So we should talk. Yes.
Well, allow me to break
informational-niche and ask a holistic question. What do you think the kind of time responsiveness of this process is? So I asked if you introduce a very rapid cultural paradigm shift, like social media or a decreased emphasis on scientific thinking, for instance. How long do you think it takes to actually have a significant impact?
Yeah, I guess that will depend on the speed of the cultural change itself, right? But I do think that whatever happens, there will be a lag time. There will be a lag time where people are sort of updating and adjusting to that. Yeah.
And so what do you think social media, for instance, something rapidly like that would have a large impact on thinking styles, or do you think that would largely be independent of something like that?
I think definitely it will have a very large impact on thinking styles. And I do think, for example, that the way we make moral judgments, if you think about it, it's become way less holistic and way more analytic over time. Yeah. So yeah.
I want to jump on James's question a little bit because you talk about your slide was you have evolution over many generations in its culture. Do you think the human brain, when born, is so plastic that it can become a holistic thinker or an analytical thinker, kind of like to James's point of the rapid change? Or do you think when born it might be predisposed to analytical versus holistic?
So if we are comparing against weird populations, I think that for most of human cultural history, children are born with probably, this is my best guess, probably quite holistic settings, because analytic cultural environments are very evolutionarily recent. Yeah, so I think probably we're all born with somewhat holistic cultural settings, and then in analytic cultures we get trained to infer from evidence in a particular way.
What do you think is the impact of immigration on these two modes of thinking? For example, if someone was born in a holistic environment and they moved into an analytic environment, how likely is the holistic and religious? Is it going to be a mixture once they adapt to the new environment?
So the people who have been working on the empirical side of things, they have found that when you look at Asian Americans who have immigrated in their childhood, for example, they're in between holistic and analytic, completely holistic, extreme holistic and extremely analytic ways of thinking. Yes.
Great, thank you. I guess off of that, my question is related to how your work can be applied to like misinformation, mental health, and wondering, like, how do you see when you have your own lab, what would you like to work on? Because you're covering such a big topic. Just curious what you're excited about.
So overall, okay, I see. Okay, right now my mind is sort of very focused on sort of next step projects. So over the next couple of years, I would love to basically be able to empirically prove some of these models, try to make analytic and holistic populations evolve in a lab setting, and that would be worked together with Fiery. I'm also interested in sort of seeing if we can find natural language processing evidence for this in corpuses of historical texts from China and the West, perhaps. And the reason for this is that it goes once again to what Fiery was saying. In some sense, all of us have been to school, and schools are very analytic environments, right? And lab environments are kind of like school environments. So it's possible that when we walk into a lab environment, we interpret the experimenter as a teacher, and so that shifts all of us to analytic ways of behaving. So in order to study this, it might be that you have to get out of the lab environment and see sort of, I don't know, advice columns. Like the advice people give, like how people reason when they talk about that, just more ecologically valid behavior. So that's the second thing. Over the very long term, I think that some of this stuff changes the way that we evaluate things. So the value that we assign to things, and that is going to involve morality and aesthetics. And so I think looking at how analytic and holistic or rich and mean ways of cognitive processing affect those realms, I think will be very important and also very timely today. Because I do think that online environments don't just affect the way we think, they also affect the way that we evaluate things. They affect how the world looks in terms of good or bad or beautiful or ugly, as well as how we actually process things through logic.
Super interesting. Thank you for the amazing talk, DC. I was struck by the argument in the depth of standardization
Yes.
section. I completely buy the overall story that we head toward more bureaucratized, more modular systems.
Yes.
But I've encountered in my own life, like if I've got a problem with my bank.
Yeah.
Suddenly, when to bureaucracy, or when you get to an edge case of the bureaucracy, it's like much more complex and extremely holistic. And I just, I need to call in some super generalists.
Yes.
What's the cultural pressure?
Yeah.
Does your model propose kind of segmenting different informational classes or knowledge worker types?
Yes. That's very interesting. I have not heard different knowledge worker types argument before. I think that's incredibly interesting. And I can totally see something like that happening, because if you have if your organization, right, or your habitual responses rely on a lot of standardized chunks of behavior, right? That means that you can only deal with the environment that also comes in these standardized bits of problems. But the problem is that that's not how the world actually is. And I think we see this, right? We see this to some degree in the kind of like bureaucratic and even political dysfunction in, for example, the United States. So we do see this. So like if we become too like sort of, or everything has to follow all these rules, it's just not good. So the broader evolutionary environment is always very non-standardized. And in fact, for example, for war in competitive contexts, right, where your goal is not to make things easier for the enemy by giving them standardized chunks of behavior, but by being sort of exploiting every single advantage that it possibly can, the enemy cannot respond by, just standardized responses. So I can totally see what you're saying. There's like this kind of like division of labor going on, and that would be very interesting to look into too. Yeah. So we should talk more about that. Yeah.
Well, actually, on that, it strikes me that you could almost imagine like there is a cycle that you go into standardization and think it's so complex to try and make the world make sense, and it goes all the way back around into like all the rules don't make sense. Could you see a similar thing happening, just like as cultures evolve, right? Like you go in these cycles of simplification and then complexification that might select for kind of across generations. I'm not sure what your time scale was, like different cycles of thinking being prioritized.
I can totally see that happening. And in fact, me and Yvonne, we have been thinking through a lot of these phenomena as well. The really interesting thing about culture as a phenomenon is that it involves both selection-like processes and learning-like processes that are happening at the same time scale. And so when you look at, there is this sense in which complex bureaucratic organization, it is an assemblage of culturally selected cultural behaviors, but it's also learning, right? It's also learning as it's going along. So both developments and both a selection-like process and development is happening at the same time. And so there's this almost like organismic quality to it. And we have been thinking about how exactly to deal with this. That means that this kind of growth and then collapse type phenomenon that you're talking about, it's totally possible for it to happen.
It seems very similar to like language, where it'll like, morphemes will, like words will expand, they get really short, like the various cycles. But
Yeah.
Yeah, love the talk. Congratulations. I have a question about like how you would speculate about the relationship between analytical thinking and standardization, like historically how they came to be. Like listening to your talk, I was just thinking about like standardization, like maybe migration and localization, and you see universal patterns. So that's one driver of it. Like analytical thinking could also drive it. But then analytical thinking, scientific, enlightenment and like industrial revolution, all of those things might have pushed it. So how do you see these two threads like converging?
So all of this stuff is very multi-causal, but right now, sort of my intuition about this is actually Joe's account. So basically the marriage and family program leading to a lot of people moving around in a very highly individualistic society, leading to organizations that have to maintain their form, even when people switch in and out of the organization. I think all of these kinds of pressures led to both more standardization and more analytic thinking. This is my suspicion, but of course, there can be more complex evolutionary models that we can try to see, like which all the different factors, we set it up and we see how the causal arrows work out. Are we out of time? Okay, so I would first like to thank all of my amazing advisors, especially Joe. Thank you so much for taking a chance on me, letting me shoot my shot. I'd like to thank a lot of my past advisors as well who have mentored me. I owe a tremendous debt to the work of a huge number of other scholars, and I want to acknowledge them here. And I'd like to thank members of my lab, members of the David Reich lab, and members of Fiery Cushman's lab as well, and also the HEB department as a whole. And I'd like to thank us. Sorry, I couldn't resist, Ivan. And also my amazing field staff who have been the amazing field staff and other members of the field site who have done so much work on the empirical side of things, none of which is in this presentation. I'd like to thank my amazing family. I couldn't have asked for better parents or a better brother. Very, very thankful for them. I love you, Quail. Thank you for beginning this journey with me. And Ben, I could not resist as well. I'd like to thank Ruggles Baptist Church. I know you guys have been praying for me for the past week. I really appreciate all of that. And I'd like to thank Longwood Christian Community, my home away from home, and all the other friends who I've made along the way and who have supported me all through this time. And last of all, I'd like to thank God. Thank you.
Congratulations, TC. It was a pleasure.